Let's start to examine moral foundations theory. In this introduction to moral foundations theory, we're going to look specifically at the concept of moral intuitions. Now, this moral intuitions is a major part of Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. That's the theory of how people respond morally, found in the book The Righteous Mind. And one of the main elements that Haidt uses to help us understand moral intuitions is a metaphor of the elephant and the rider. And the elephant and the rider represent our mind. And you've got a rider on top of an elephant, and the rider kind of controls the elephant. At least the rider thinks they control the elephant, but really the elephant goes wherever the elephant wants to go. Perhaps he'll be influenced by the rider, perhaps not. So the elephant is the big part, and the rider is the small part, but the rider is a rational human being. Now, in this metaphor, the elephant is all of the automatic processes that go on inside of our mind, all of the emotions, including the moral emotions. It's also called intuition, and so that's why we're talking about moral intuitions. So this elephant, the automatic processes, include both material and non-material, immaterial phenomena. So the material might be the stuff that's actually happening in the brain that we can observe, like chemical reactions and electrical signals going through the neurons in the brains. But it also yields immaterial things that we experience, things like emotions and moods. In fact, all of what we call human nature, this immaterial human nature, would be part of the elephant. From a Christian point of view, it's what the Bible calls the law of God written on our hearts, the way that humans are, and all the phenomena that happen automatically because of what our nature is. So that's the elephant, the automatic processes that occur in our mind, or intuition. And the rider is our rational thought, our conscious reasoning, the part of our mind that we can control and think about and process information with and evaluate through rational thought. So that's the two parts of the mind. Now, let's move on and talk about some models of moral judgments. How do the elephant and the rider interact so that we decide what's morally right or morally wrong? We're going to look at three models, and we're going to start off with a simple one, a medium one, and then we're going to look at Jonathan Haidt's really complex one that you'll need to, this will just be an introduction to it. So we start off with the simplest model, and we're going to go back to Kohlberg, the moral development theory with Hines. And in the rationalist or the Kohlberg model, there's some event. So you might remember from Kohlberg, we have the story of Hines, who has a wife who's sick and is going to die, and the pharmacist won't sell the medicine at a reasonable price, and Hines has to decide if he's going to steal the medicine or not. So there's some event, like Hines's wife getting sick and him not being able to obtain the medicine. And in the Kohlberg model, the event leads to rational thoughts, and the rational thoughts can either lead Hines to steal the medicine or to not steal the medicine. These rational thoughts lead to moral judgments on what the right thing to do is. So that seems like a pretty reasonable way of how we make decisions, except the problem is it doesn't allow room for emotions. And we know through lots of studies and experiments that the emotions influence our moral judgments an awful lot. We've got all these automatic processes, this elephant that we're sitting on top of, and it's not just the rider who determines where they're going, but the elephant has an influence also. So we start So we have this simple model where some event happens, we think about it, and then we decide what to do. Let's go to a little bit more complex model, and this is what Jonathan Haidt calls the Jeffersonian dual process model. Thomas Jefferson described this phenomena, and this dual process model has been studied quite a bit in social psychology and organizational psychology, where we basically have two processes that are influencing our moral judgment. So in this event, what we have is we've got some event that happens. Suppose you're at work and you decide to, you hear about some project that your supervisor has, and you think, ooh, I see some problems there. So you go and ask a question of your supervisor about that project. Well, that leads to some type of emotion in your supervisor, and your supervisor is going to have some moral judgment based on the emotion that they felt when you asked that question. And they might decide whether you're good or bad. Is what you're saying worth thinking about or not? And it depends a lot on the emotion. If the emotion was, oh, that's a relief, I'm glad to get some more information, they might pass a positive moral judgment. If their emotion was feeling threatened and afraid, their moral judgment was that, oh, that person is such a troublemaker. Now, in the Jeffersonian model here, after the moral judgment, there's thinking can occur. Like, oh, was I right to get upset? Or is the person's question actually legitimate? And this reasoning can also influence the person's moral judgment, and so it can change the moral judgment. And so there's a dual process on what influences people's moral judgment. It's not just the logical reasoning that they do, but also the emotions that they feel, and they both contribute to moral judgments. So that's why we have two arrows going into two different directions for moral judgments. Now, this model is really important to understand the idea that there's two factors influencing our moral judgment: emotion and reasoning. The third version that we're going to look at is more complicated, but if you don't, and it's going to be almost impossible to understand if you don't understand the second model, where that there's two sets of influences: our emotions and our reasoning, that influences our moral judgment. Okay, so let's move on to the third model of moral judgment. And this is what Haidt calls the social intuitionist model. And this is from his book, The Righteous Mind. And what I've done is I've copied an illustration that he has on page 47. So we're just going to briefly go over this. And the idea is that there's some triggering event. So, for example, you ask your supervisor some question about a project, and then your supervisor has some type of automatic process that goes on, some type of intuition, some type of emotion that occurs. And then that intuition, suppose he feels really threatened by you asking the question. So that's going to lead to a moral judgment about what you did. And so if he feels threatened, he's going to judge as what you've done as bad. And so your supervisor's made some judgment that you've done something bad, and that can lead to he's got to start thinking, oh, why am I feeling so bad about what you did? And that can lead to moral reasoning, this idea that, there's reasons for me condemning you for asking the question. Perhaps your supervisor is going to say, oh, that employee is so insubordinate, or that employee is so arrogant. How dare he question me? And they'll come up with, you can come up with all kinds of reasons to justify your moral judgment. So that's the main set of that's the main series of events. These dotted arrows occur less often. Reasoning can actually influence your intuition and your judgment. Perhaps your boss is going to say, maybe I shouldn't have gotten so upset at him. Or perhaps the reasoning will say, yes, they're a horribly insubordinate employee, and not only should I have gotten mad at him, I should have fired them. And I didn't react strongly enough. And so 5 and 6 indicate how our reasoning can influence our intuition and judgment so that we make a different moral judgment. And Haidt argues that that doesn't happen very often. We go mainly on just our intuition to make our judgment, and then that judgment influences our reasoning. Now, Haidt calls this the social intuitionist model because a lot of processes occur when we're present with other people. So your boss has decided to fire you because you're insubordinate, and then he thinks, uh-oh, I've got to explain this to my manager. And so your boss is going to start thinking on, okay, how can I influence my my manager? What can I say to them so that they have an emotional reaction that will that they'll agree with, and that my judgment will end up being the same as their judgment. So your supervisor starts thinking of things to say to their manager to influence their intuition so that they have a similar judgment. Now, your boss's manager might not have the same judgment. Your boss's manager might be saying, well, you should be thankful for an employee that wants to think things through thoroughly. And so B's judgment and B's reasoning might go back and influence your supervisor's reasoning, either positively or negatively. So this bottom line is a level of social influence that affects us at an emotional level, which will in turn affect our moral judgments and our reasoning, which again can go back and influence our emotions and our judgments. So this is the social intuitionist model of moral judgments, looking at how an event, our emotions, and our reasoning, as well as other people's emotions and reasonings, can influence our judgment on whether something is good or bad.